Thank you very much, Paul. And we can move now to the next speaker, Laurent Jammes. What role for society in the energy transition, social governance for the subsurface industry, and Giovanni will present Laurent.
Yes, Laurent, if I may,
I'll
just introduce you and then give you back the controls. Sorry for that. So Laurent, I'm pleased to introduce you. So Laurent is the Director of Industrial Relations for the Universe and Earth Science Institute of the National Research Council of France. So his role in that institution is to he's in charge of the valorization of the activities of the ENCU and in charge of managing the innovation of the institute. In that role, he needs to is actually managing the research projects that are made collaboratively with the industrial partners in France, and in particular, he acts as an officer for the industry contribution from the French industry for two projects, for the European Southern Observatory and for the Square Kilometre Array Telescope. How did he get there? So he's before that he's acted as a consultant in energy transition, actually quite pioneer in that. So he's co-founded a firm, Active B, whose role was mostly, if I say, to investigate the social role, the social aspects of the deployment of new technologies, of energy transition technologies, and he's also acted as an advisor for ENEA Consulting. So he built his expertise in new energy technologies, on renewables, on hydrogen especially, and on energy storage, and also on geothermal. He's been in Schlumberger before that, mostly acting in a position in research and development, not only in France, but also in China. And he closed his career in Schlumberger with carbon services, which was the segment that existed until a few years ago, that was in charge of deploying solutions to the CO2 storage industry, and where Laurent was the marketing and technique manager. So Laurent, I hope I haven't forgotten anything, and I'll leave you to your presentation now.
Thank you, Giovanni. Okay. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, good evening to everybody first. Of course, I will start by thanking the EAGE Local Chapter for inviting me to present some thoughts on the issue of social acceptability of subsurface engineering projects, and on the role of civil society, not only in the definition of energy transition roadmaps, but also in the concrete implementation of technology deployment projects. And I will take a few minutes at the end of my talk to present to you a large collaborative research project addressing this topic, which includes a significant contribution from social sciences, and it's called the GEFISS project for gouvernance élargie pour les filières d'ingénierie du sous-sol in French. So we are all experiencing significant difficulties in deploying subsurface engineering projects, even when these are directly part of the energy transition effort. It's true in many areas, geothermal energy, and of course also CO2 storage and even energy storage. So these are often the subject of strong opposition from civil society stakeholders. Associated with this observation, the concept of social acceptability itself has been highly criticized, especially by sociologists in France, because it is perceived as the attempt of a project developer to pass, by influence, an already defined project. So in this case, what is denounced is that the concept of social acceptability refers more to a final objective than to a process that would work on creating the most favorable conditions for a project to be implemented without prejudging its actual realization, of course. So these various observations lead to rethinking and strengthening the modes of engagement of external stakeholders, and particularly the civil society ones, Some of these may be mandatory, imposed by the regulatory framework, or simply proactive because of the will of a project proponent. So this commitment can, as we will see, go as far as sharing certain aspects of the governance of a project. So here is a short and non-exhaustive list of the reasons mentioned by external stakeholders for opposing a project. And we can browse them quickly because they are quite informative. So first of all, the lack of understanding of the technology, which arouses mistrust towards it. That's quite common. Then the well-known not in my backyard syndrome, where the stakeholders agree to recognize the interest of a project, but do not want to see it carried out in their neighborhood. Another reason is the feeling that the project brings more nuisances than benefits, and often that the positive returns do not benefit those to suffer the nuisances. A certain number of stakeholders also regret not being involved in the decision-making process, which leads to the choice and the conditions for carrying out a project. Another reason for mistrust is linked to the lack of anchorage of certain project proponents who are not known to the actors of the territory. Or that information or discussion with local stakeholders comes too late, when the project is too committed for it to be possible to modify it. Or that the project holder or the local authority which supports it does not give all the information, that they lack of transparency. Not by these, the NGOs also often criticize not being consulted or being too late, again, in the choice for a project or its implementation conditions. And finally, the distributions of role and responsibilities is not always clear, in particular that of experts and scientists, with the feeling of the existence of conflict of interest. And we have seen that in French projects. So what can we do to address that? It's clear that what we see from consultation meetings is that stakeholders want to play an increasingly active role in two major kind of debates. The first concerns the energy transition itself, the roadmap chosen by the regions, the resulting ways of living together, the choice of technological options to engage in the energy transitions. And stakeholders have questions like, what should be the contribution to the overall effort of the territory and of a specific technology, for instance, in the reduction of greenhouse gases? What is a reasonable effort for the territory given its potential? And they show a lot of concerns on the choice of technologies, which of course, in their view, must be in line with the roadmap and compatible with the needs of the territory. So the second topic is about the choice of a specific project and their implementation, and especially their conditions of implementations. So stakeholders are concerned about the project implementation conditions themselves, which should be debated to decide on the best option, and that includes a discussion on the design of the project themselves. They are also concerned about the return for the territory, but also, of course, the risk, how to address them, the nuisances again, and the way they can be mitigated and sometimes compensated. And finally, about the decision process itself, not only to select a project and specific design, but also the decision process associated to the monitoring of the operation. And these two dimensions are called project legitimacy on one side and project implementation quality on the other. So to address these requests, standard practices should evolve to include active stakeholder engagement. It's true that practices have evolved rapidly already from a situation where project proponents were simply performing an environmental and social impact assessment plan, from which they derived a risk mitigation plan and hopefully a societal action plan with the hope of achieving social acceptability. In that case, potential actions from the civil society were essentially seen as risk and external stakeholders more as potential enemies than allies. With the goal of better integrating a project in its environment, preliminary studies and the territorial context of a project are now quite common. They include a project context analysis, a project stakeholder identification and mapping, and the identification of the main issues or stakes that stakeholder may have with the project implementation itself. And this is often done through limited discussion with local actors, but this is not really stakeholder engagement. So we believe that the most favorable conditions for the realization of a project are obtained through an active stakeholder engagement process where external stakeholders participate in debates, as we have seen, about the project, its legitimacy in the context of both the territory and the energy transition, and the conditions of its implementation. So we are now talking of a co-construction process, at least for some aspects of a project. It's clear that these debates and discussion or decision meetings have to be planned and organized properly with the help of consultation specialists. So the previous process has to be aligned, of course, with the project technical implementation workflow, which is very familiar to us with the sequence of phases like feasibility, design, procurement and construction, operations and decommissioning, and so on. And with the permitting process itself, during which specific consultation processes such as public hearings or public debates may have to be organized, especially for CO2 storage if it happens in France. So three main goals should be considered for the project developer. So first, understand the project environment. Second, integrate the project in its environment. And third, managing the project impacts on the environment on a regular basis. So it's clear that responsibilities and expertise should be shared, but also all project dimensions should not be treated in the same way. The project developer will be mainly responsible for defining the best techno-economic conditions of realization of its project, and the ultimate decision to implement it belongs to him, of course. But I think that other dimensions, for instance, related to the socio-environmental impacts of a project, can be considered for a shared governance, where decisions are taken by an extended group involving external stakeholders. So before concluding my talk, I would like to present you quickly a large collaborative research project which aims to develop methodologies and tools to address and implement what we have just discussed. So the different words used for the definition of its objectives were very carefully chosen. So I will read the objective of the GEFISS project and not approximate it. It is, as mentioned on the slide, that the aim is to promote engagement of the various stakeholders in an informed dialogue on the exploitation of the underground resources in the context of energy transition to facilitate its implementation. So this dialogue may relate to the sectors of its exploitation or to the realization of a specific project in a given territory. And in the case of favorable conditions, a second objective is to encourage the co-construction of the conditions of its implementation. So here there are very important words which are promote engagement first, meaning that stakeholders are encouraged to come and debate. The second important word is informed dialogue. It means here that the dialogue should be as objective as possible, based on facts and not opinions, and a shared understanding of technologies. And we know that the layman very often is lacking of understanding of both the subsurface conditions and the technologies. And then, of course, the goal is still to create the most favorable conditions for the realization of a project. And finally, the process moves towards a co-construction process where stakeholders work together to implement the best projects. So I have listed below this objective the different research topics which are addressed by the different partners of the project, but I won't discuss them in detail. That would take too long. So what is quite unique with the GEFISS project is that we have an aggregation of backgrounds and expertise that are put together, comprising multidisciplinary teams from humanities and social scientists, consultation specialists, which are working in close collaboration with industry and research institutes and representative of states. We have really a fantastic mix of people here. And we are working on issues like formation, communication, economy, law, regulatory environment, public policy, geography, sociology, perception and attitude of stakeholders, for instance, in a framework where we try to couple human sciences, which are sciences of the individual, like psychology, cognitive psychology, group dynamics, and social sciences, like the sociology of technique, sociology of risk, and socio-political sciences. And we also act both as observers and actors in order to derive best practices that will be tested and in the field. So this consortium gathers now 15 partners with a total budget of more than 3.5 million euro, which is quite unique in the domain of social sciences. So for conclusion, what I would like to stress is that, of course, engaging the civil society is quite important, but it won't be enough if we have a favorable context, which, in my view, articulates three different dimensions. So first, of course, we have to have the right prerequisite. And if we take the example of France, for instance, in order to envision the exploitation of subsurface resources or to use the subsurface, we have to have a clear idea of the subsurface resources themselves, which is, for instance, for geothermal, the geothermal potential, but for energy storage, it will be the energy storage potential, for instance, and whether it corresponds to the energy system needs, of course, on surface. We have also to have the right activities, for a lot of activities in research and development, to develop subsurface technologies which are applicable and useful for the context of the territory, France, for instance. Then at a national level, and Paul has talked about it, we have to have a roadmap, very clear objectives, and an appropriate environment, especially in terms of regulation and law. So we have that with the SNBC, the Stratégie Nationale Bas Carbone. We have that with the PPE. Now we have to have also an implementation plan, a deployment plan, which really goes into the planning of what will be realized in the coming years. And of course, we have to have also the adequate regulatory environment. And as you may know, there is an ongoing revision of the mining law these days, which hopefully will converge in a better regulatory environment. And then there is the last dimension is the local one. I would say it's quite important because projects will be implemented in territories, and we all know that the implementation of energy transition has very much to do about regions. And for that, we have first, in my view, to have a clear contribution established for the project to the energy transition of the territory. So that has to be demonstrated and proved. Then we have to have a strong and lasting support from local politicians and regional state services, which is not always obtained, especially similar to the not in my backyard syndrome. We have also the not in my election year syndrome, and that does not help. And finally, we have to have what I was talking about in my presentation, the engagement of civil society stakeholders in the decision-making process for carrying out a project. So that will conclude my talk, and I'm ready for questions if you have any.
Thank you, Laurent. So you can start typing questions for Laurent.
Yes, that's we are moving to that. It's interesting. We are moving to that little by little, and because of some time crisis in the world of deep geothermal energy. We are working on that also for new technologies like the CO2 dissolved concept that you may have heard about, which is still in research and soon hopefully in demonstration, which consists in coupling a geothermal doublet with a CO2 storage operation by dissolving the CO2 in the water that you reinject. So, so definitely, when a new project idea comes up, we are trying to promote that. We are also going to push for that for energy storage, for instance, hydrogen storage projects, but I can't talk too much about it, or other subsurface operations that are again too early for me to talk about them. So it's too early to say that it will be successful. But definitely, we believe that in France, at least in France, we have to go through that. We tested this approach also in different projects, like, for instance, pipeline transportation projects. So in France, we really believe that the opposition can be so strong that if we don't do that, we will fail. Yes, definitely. Lithium co-production is a very interesting activity, and when we have a demonstration project clearly planned, we will very likely use this kind of approach to accompany it. So how to engage local authorities? I mean, the first thing you have to do with local authorities, of course, it depends a lot what you call about local authorities. I mean, local communities or local, I mean, if you talk about, for instance, if you talk about regions or cities, we have to go and talk to them and work with them to really to make the project a regional one, and to make sure that the project will fit with their ambitions in terms of energy transition. So that's quite important. Again, as I said before, the project has to be positioned in the energy transition roadmap of a specific territory. So that's one thing. Apart from that, if you think about local authorities like DREAL, for instance, definitely they have also to be engaged more on the conditions of implementations of a specific project, and quite important also on the monitoring aspects, the monitoring of the risk of the operations themselves, and we have to work with them, and this is being done for a few projects already, in defining the monitoring protocol for surveillance.
Laurent, there was a question where the geoscientist community can play a role in this new approach.
I think that the geoscientist community is very, very important in informing and educating people, about geosciences, what is subsurface, how we represent, how we work with the subsurface itself, what are the technologies that we use commonly to exploit its resources, and how we ensure that all risks are properly prevented and mitigated. There is a dialogue to happen with the public on these aspects, but we have to be very, very cautious to be understood by the public. So this dialogue is not immediate, I would say. We have to work on making ourselves clear, especially when we interact with the public. And then we have to leave some space to the public to make its own opinion without being influenced to some extent. At one stage, the public has to have access to the knowledge and information and discuss together with all the other stakeholders to make an informed, to produce, to create an informed opinion about the project.
Thank you very much, Laurent. And we can move now to the last presentation from Christophe Rigolet, implementing efficient underground solutions for a successful ecological transition, a new challenge for society and geoscientists. And Jean-Charles, you are going to present, Christophe.